My father was standing under a chandelier worth more than my first car when he said the sentence that finally made me stand up. "No, child," Gordon Whitfield told the room, his voice slow and polished, "should ever be left outside a closed door." 220 people applauded. They applauded because they believed him. They saw the former family court judge, the man who had spent 30 years deciding where children belonged. They saw my mother beside him in her navy silk dress, one hand pressed over her heart, smiling with that soft church lady expression she had practiced until it looked like kindness. Behind them, on the ballroom screen, was a photograph of my parents holding my niece and nephew last spring. Elaine had posted that same picture online with the caption, "Grandchildren are God's second chance at love." I stood near the back of the Harbor House Children's Fund Gala with my phone in my hand and felt my thumb rest against the video file. 9 days earlier, those same loving grandparents had closed their front door on my sister Juliet while she stood on their porch in 38-degree weather, holding her 9-week-old daughter against her chest, while her 4-year-old son struggled to breathe beside her. They did not know I had the footage. They did not know their neighbor's camera had caught the porch light, the rain, my father's hand on the door, my mother's face over his shoulder, and Juliet's voice breaking when she begged for one night of shelter. They thought I had come alone because I had chosen them. My mother turned slightly and smiled at me from the stage, proud and relieved, as if I were still the daughter who understood when silence was expected. I looked at my father. I looked at the screen. Then I walked toward the microphone. "Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet your phone battery is at 38% right now, right? If that's true, type 1. If not, type 2. Let's see whether I got it right." Alright, enough talking, let's begin the story. Before I reached the microphone that night, before the ballroom lights turned cold and every smile in that room learned what my parents had done, you have to understand the kind of house I came from. The Whitfield home in Brentwood never felt messy enough to be real. Even when we were children, there were no shoes by the door, no mail stacked on the counter, no cereal boxes left open in the pantry. My mother believed clutter was a confession. Every room had to look ready for company, even when no company was coming. The pillows on the sofa were angled. The family Bible sat open on the foyer table. The silver-framed photographs along the hallway told one story only: graduations, church picnics, charity dinners, courthouse ceremonies, Sunday clothes, perfect teeth. That was how my parents loved us through presentation. My father, Gordon Whitfield, had spent most of his adult life in family court, wearing a black robe and deciding which parents were fit, which homes were stable, which children needed protection. People spoke about him like he was carved out of principle. They called him fair, stern, but fair. I heard that phrase so often. Growing up, it became part of the wallpaper. At home, he did not yell much. He did not have to. He could lower his glasses, pause for 3 seconds, and make you feel like you were standing before him in court. If he asked a question, it was never really a question. It was an opening statement. My mother, Elaine, supplied the warmth people expected from a man like him. She chaired church committees, arranged flowers for funerals, delivered casseroles to widows, and knew exactly where to place her hand on someone's shoulder so it looked tender from across a room. At fundraisers, donors trusted her with checks. Online, strangers left comments beneath her photos calling her graceful, generous, blessed. Inside our family, grace had conditions. You could struggle, as long as your struggle looked respectable. You could fail, as long as it happened quietly. You could be hurt, as long as you did not make the family explain why. My younger sister Juliet learned that earlier than I did. She was softer, more hopeful, always the one trying to believe our parents meant well underneath the control. I was different. I watched patterns. I remembered wording. I noticed when my father said stability, but meant obedience. When my mother said prayer, but meant silence. In our house, love was real only when it photographed well, and shame was anything that could not be cropped out. Juliet became the part of the photograph they could not crop cleanly anymore on a Thursday night in November. It was the 13th of November 2025. The first real cold snap of the season. The kind Nashville never prepares for properly because everyone pretends winter is still weeks away. The temperature had dropped to 38 degrees by 9 o'clock, and a thin, mean rain had started falling over Brentwood, not dramatic enough to make the news, just steady enough to soak through a coat and make a child's breathing turn fragile. Juliet had left Caleb that afternoon. She did not do it loudly. That was never her way. She packed 2 diaper bags, 3 changes of clothes for her 4-year-old son, Noah, the baby's clinic papers, and the little canvas pouch where she kept birth certificates, insurance cards, and the emergency cash she had been hiding in 20s behind a box of oatmeal. Caleb had drained most of their joint account 2 weeks earlier. He called it moving money around. Juliet called it what it was, only after she found the hotel receipt and the text messages from the woman who answered phones at his roofing office. Even then, she had not wanted revenge. She wanted one safe night. She drove to our parents' house because, despite everything, some part of her still believed that a mother would open the door if her daughter arrived with children in the cold. The porch light was on when she pulled into the driveway. Through the front windows, she could see the warm yellow glow of the foyer, the polished table, and the fall wreath Elaine had probably adjusted twice that week. Juliet carried the baby against her chest and held Noah's hand with the other. He was small for his age, and his breathing had already started to sound tight. Not dangerous yet, but close enough that Juliet knew the sound. Gordon opened the door after the second knock. Elaine stood behind him in a cream cardigan, her mouth already pressed into that thin line she used when disappointment needed witnesses. "Please, Dad," Juliet said. "Just tonight. I don't have anywhere else to take them." My father looked past her, toward the driveway, as if checking whether the neighbors could see. "You have a home," he said. "Go back to your husband." Juliet shifted the baby higher under her coat. "Caleb emptied our account. Noah's cold. I just need a few hours to figure out." Elaine stepped forward then, not enough to enter the rain, just enough to be heard. "Don't use those children to make us part of your shame." Noah coughed. Juliet looked down at him, then back at them. The door closed before she could ask again. She did not call me right away. That was one of the things I understood later and hated most. Juliet sat in that car, trying to make my parents less cruel in her own mind. She told herself they were shocked. She told herself Elaine would come outside in 10 minutes with a blanket, that Gordon would call her back to the porch once his pride cooled down. That was how our family trained us to survive them. We learned to give their worst moments better explanations than they deserved. At 11:26 p.m., my phone lit up on the desk in my office at Vanderline Regional Medical Center. I had been there since 7 that morning, working through staffing issues, a delayed surgical transfer, and an emergency department so backed up every hallway felt narrower than it was. The coffee beside me had gone cold. I remember thinking I would finish one more report and drive home. Then I saw Juliet's name. I answered with the tired half-smile people use before they know their life is about to change. "Hey, Jules." For a second, there was only static and rain. Then I heard Noah cough. Not a normal cough. A tight, shallow sound that made my spine straighten before Juliet said a word. "Mara," she whispered. I stood up. "Where are you?" "In the car." "Why?" The baby started crying then, weak and thin, more like a warning than a sound. Juliet breathed in sharply, and I could hear her moving, fumbling with blankets or straps or both. "Tell me exactly where you are," I said. "Down the street from Mom and Dad's." The room around me seemed to narrow. "Are the kids inside the car with you?" "Yes." "How long?" "I don't know. Since a little after 9. Her voice cracked. "I thought they might call. I thought maybe Mom would." I closed my laptop with one hand and grabbed my keys with the other. "Is the engine running?" A pause. "No." I didn't want to waste gas. That sentence did something to me. My sister was sitting outside a 6-bedroom house, rationing gas with a 9-week-old baby and a wheezing child in the back seat. "I'm coming," I said. By the time I reached Brentwood, my hands were locked around the steering wheel. I found her car under a maple tree near the corner, windows fogged, hazards off. Juliet looked up when my headlights swept across her windshield. Her face was pale, her coat damp at the shoulders. Noah was half asleep in the back, breathing too fast. Baby Clara was pressed against Juliet's chest, her tiny face hot when I touched her forehead. "We're going to the ER," I said. Juliet started to apologize. I opened the passenger door and looked at her until she stopped. "Not another word, get in my car." The ER did not ask for the family version of the story. That was the first relief. Hospitals do not care how a thing looks in a Christmas card. They care about temperatures, oxygen levels, skin color, respiratory effort, and whether a baby's cry has gone too weak. They care about what is true enough to document. I carried Clara through the sliding doors while Juliet kept one hand on Noah's shoulder and the other pressed against her own chest like she was trying to hold herself together from the outside. The waiting room was half full, the way emergency rooms are at night, with people slumped in chairs under fluorescent lights, everyone hoping their crisis would be called before someone else's. I walked straight to the triage desk and kept my voice level. 9. Week-old female, fever, prolonged cold exposure, weak cry. 4-year-old male, history of mild asthma, increased work of breathing after sitting in a cold vehicle for over 2 hours. The nurse looked up fast. That was the difference between panic and language. Panic made people freeze. Language moved them. Within minutes, Clara was on a warmer with a probe under her arm, her little fists opening and closing like she was fighting something invisible. Noah sat on the edge of a bed with a small mask over his face, taking slow breaths while a respiratory tech coached him gently. Juliet stood between the two beds, turning her head back and forth, as if choosing one child meant failing the other. Dr. Camille Price came in with her hair pulled into a loose knot and the calm expression of someone who had already seen enough that night. She checked Clara first, then Noah, then looked at Juliet and said, "You did the right thing coming in." Juliet's face crumpled at that, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for me to see how badly she had needed one adult in authority to say it. Clara's temperature was 102.9. Noah's oxygen was acceptable, but his breathing was tight enough to treat and watch. Mild dehydration, cold exposure, respiratory distress. The words went into the chart one by one, clean and permanent. For the first time that night, what my parents had done was no longer just something Juliet said. It was becoming a record. Then my phone started vibrating. "Gordon." I stepped into the hallway before answering. "The children are being treated." There was a short silence. Then my father said, "Are you bringing Juliet back to her husband when they're discharged?" I stared at the beige hospital wall in front of me. "Your granddaughter has a fever," I said. "Your grandson needed breathing treatment." He exhaled, controlled and disappointed. "I'm sorry to hear that, but the larger issue remains Juliet's instability." Before I could answer, Elaine's voice came through, softer and worse. They had me on speaker. "Mara, don't turn this into something ugly. We have worked too hard for this family to be dragged into Juliet's drama." Then another voice joined them. "Bennett, if she keeps refusing to go home," he said, "we may need to discuss whether she's fit to make decisions for those kids right now." I looked through the glass at Juliet, still standing between both beds, one hand resting on each child, and I finally understood. They were not worried she had no shelter. They were counting on it. I did not argue with them on the phone. That was the first decision I made that night with a clear mind. I ended the call while Bennett was still speaking. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I finally understood that words were exactly what they wanted from me. Anger could be quoted. Panic could be used. One wrong sentence would become proof that Juliet had infected everyone around her with instability. So I put my phone in my pocket and went back into the room. Juliet looked up immediately. "What did they say?" I looked at Clara under the warmer, then at Noah breathing through the mask, and chose the only answer that would not break her in half. "They're still thinking about themselves." She closed her eyes. She already knew. After several hours of tests and observation, Dr. Price cleared both children with strict instructions, prescriptions, and follow-up appointments. Juliet signed the discharge papers with a hand that shook so badly the nurse gently placed her palm over the page to keep it still. I watched her write her name and realized how much of survival looked like paperwork. Not bravery, not speeches. Just a tired woman signing forms because her children needed somewhere safe to sleep. That somewhere was my apartment. It was not prepared for 3 extra people. There were no cribs, no toddler snacks, no soft nightlights shaped like moons. There was a gray couch, a narrow guest room, and a stack of emergency blankets I kept in the closet because old habits from ambulance work do not leave you easily. Juliet apologized before we even crossed the threshold. I ignored it and put Noah on the couch with cartoons low enough not to wake Clara. While Juliet changed the baby in the bedroom, I opened my laptop at the kitchen counter. Elaine's newest Facebook post was at the top of my feed. It was a photo from September, taken in our parents' backyard. My mother was holding Clara in a white blanket while Noah sat on Gordon's knee, smiling at something outside the frame. The caption read, "Grandchildren are God's reminder that love continues." Below it, someone had written, "You and Judge Whitfield are such beautiful examples of family." I stared at that sentence until it stopped looking like English. Then Bennett's email came in. Subject line, "Family Stability Plan." He wrote that Juliet's emotional state required firm intervention. He suggested our parents provide temporary care for the children while Juliet reconsidered her choices and returned to a stable marital environment. He copied no attorney, no doctor, no social worker. Just me, our parents, and Caleb. I read it twice. Then I started saving everything. Screenshots, timestamps, headers, attachments, the post, the comments, the email. Not because I wanted a fight, because they had already started one. The first real evidence came from a man I had not spoken to since I was 17. His name was Owen Dillard, and he lived 2 houses down from my parents, in a brick ranch with trimmed hedges and a flag that was always replaced before it faded. When I was a kid, I only knew him as the neighbor who waved from his driveway and handed out full-size candy bars on Halloween. I learned later that he had spent 26 years as a 911 dispatcher before retiring, which meant he understood something most people did not. Emergencies did not always announce themselves with sirens. Sometimes they looked like a woman standing too long on a porch while everyone pretended not to see her. He called at 10:14 that morning. "Mara Whitfield?" His voice was careful, older than I remembered. "Yes, this is Owen Dillard. I live near your folks." My hand tightened around the phone. "I know who you are." There was a pause, and in that pause, I heard him deciding how much to say. "My doorbell camera picked up something last night. Your sister was at their house." I looked toward the guest room, where Juliet had finally fallen asleep sitting upright against the headboard, Clara tucked against her shoulder. "What did it catch?" I asked. "Enough," he said. "More than enough." He did not make me ask twice. 5 minutes later, the video landed in my inbox. I sat alone at the kitchen counter before opening it. Noah's cartoon murmured from the living room. The apartment smelled like baby formula, damp coats, and hospital soap. I clicked play. The footage was black and white, grainy at the edges, but clear where it mattered. The timestamp read 9:18 p.m. Rain crossed the frame in silver lines. Juliet stood under the porch light with Clara pressed to her chest. Noah leaned against her leg, shoulders lifted the way children do when they are trying not to cry. The door opened. My father filled the doorway. My mother appeared behind him, one hand holding the edge of her cardigan closed. Juliet's voice came through thin, but understandable. "Dad, please. Noah's breathing is getting bad." Gordon did not step outside. "Then take him home," he said. "I don't have a home tonight." Elaine's answer came instantly. "That was your choice." Then the door closed. No music, no explanation, no family history. Just a porch, a sick child, a woman begging, and 2 people choosing warmth for themselves. I watched it once, then again. Then I downloaded the file, saved it in 3 places, and forwarded it to myself with the subject line, "Do not lose this." For the first time since Juliet called me, I stopped wondering whether I could prove what happened. The camera already had. I called Renee Malloy after I watched the video for the 3rd time. Renee had represented 2 nurses from Vanderline during a custody dispute years earlier, and I remembered her because she never raised her voice, not once, even when the opposing attorney tried to turn the hearing into theater. She had the kind of calm that did not soothe people, it organized them. She answered on the 4th ring. "Mara Whitfield," she said. "Tell me this is not a hospital problem." "It's my sister," I said. The line went quiet. I gave it to her in order, because order was the only thing keeping my hands steady. Thursday night. Brentwood. Locked door. Cold exposure. ER records. Bennett's email. Elaine's post. Owen's video. I did not embellish. I did not need to. The truth was ugly enough without decoration. When I finished, Renee was silent for almost 10 seconds. Then she said, "Do not call your parents." I wasn't planning to. "You were thinking about it." I looked toward the hallway where Juliet was sleeping, and hated that Renee was right. Some part of me still wanted to hear my father explain himself in a way that made him less monstrous. Some part of me still wanted my mother to break first and say she had made a mistake. Renee continued, "People like this are most dangerous when they believe they can still control the room. If you warn them, they will clean the room." I sat down slowly. "What do you need?" I asked. "Everything in its original form. The video file, not just a screen recording. The hospital discharge papers. Any medication instructions. Screenshots with timestamps. Bennett's full email with headers if you can get them. Elaine's post before she deletes it. Names of anyone who saw Juliet that night, or saw the children afterward." I opened a blank document and started typing while she spoke. "And Mara?" "Yes. Do not turn this into a family argument. Turn it into a timeline." That sentence changed the shape of the day. I made folders, one for medical records, one for communications, one for social media, one for video. I called Dr. Price's office and requested copies through the proper channel. I asked Owen to preserve the original footage. I saved Elaine's post as a PDF. I exported Bennett's email with full headers and forwarded it to Renee. By noon, my kitchen counter looked less like a place for coffee and more like a command center. Juliet woke up near 1, barefoot, pale, carrying Clara against her chest. "What are you doing?" she asked. I looked at the screen, at the growing list of times and names and files, making sure they don't get to rewrite last night. They tried anyway. By late afternoon, I had built enough of a timeline to see the shape of what they had done, but not the full size of what they were planning. That came at 4:37 p.m., when an email landed in an old family account I had not used in years. The subject line was simple: "Draft remarks for Saturday." At first, I almost deleted it. Then I saw Bennett's name in the forwarded chain, along with a campaign assistant I did not recognize. Bennett had been preparing to announce his city council run before Christmas, and every word he said in public had already started passing through someone whose job was to make selfish things sound civic-minded. I opened the attachment. The first page was harmless enough. Thank yous, donor acknowledgements, a line about Harbor House, and the importance of community. Then I reached the section marked Family Moment. I read the first sentence twice because my mind refused to accept it the first time. This week, my parents, Gordon and Elaine Whitfield, quietly opened their home and hearts to their grandchildren during a difficult family transition. My hands went still on the keyboard. The next paragraph was worse. It described Juliet as a beloved family member currently seeking stability. It said my parents believed children should never become casualties of adult conflict. It praised their willingness to step in when young lives need structure, shelter, and unconditional love. Unconditional. That was the word that made me stand up. Not because it surprised me, because it confirmed something colder than anger. My parents had not simply panicked that night. They had not made one cruel decision and regretted it in the morning. They had already begun turning the cruelty into a story where they were the rescuers. I kept reading. Near the end, Bennett had typed a line in bold, probably meant for my father. No child should ever be left without shelter, and no door should remain closed to a child in need. I stared at that sentence until the apartment around me went quiet. Noah's cartoon was still playing. Clara was making small, sleepy sounds in the bedroom. Juliet was resting for the first time in almost 24 hours. And across town, in a house with polished floors and perfect porch lights, my family was preparing to stand in front of 200 people and accept applause for opening a door they had closed. I forwarded the email to Renee without adding a message. She called less than a minute later. "You understand what this is?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "They're not just denying it." I looked at the video file sitting in the folder beside Bennett's draft speech. "They're trying to steal the rescue," I said. Renee's voice lowered. "Then let them walk onto the stage first." Saturday arrived with the kind of blue November sky that made Nashville look innocent. By then, my apartment had become a place of lowered voices and careful movements. Juliet stayed with the children. Renee had copies of everything. Owen had confirmed he would preserve the original footage. Dr. Price's records were already in the file. I had slept 3 hours the night before, not because I was calm, but because my body had finally stopped asking permission to collapse. The gala was held downtown in a hotel ballroom with marble floors, gold uplighting, and floral centerpieces large enough to block half the room from seeing across the table. Harbor House Children's Fund had printed my parents' names in raised lettering on the program. Gordon and Elaine Whitfield, Legacy of Compassion Award. Beneath that was a short paragraph about their decades of service to vulnerable children and families. I read it once, then folded the program in half and held it in my lap. 220 guests filled the room slowly. Judges, attorneys, church members, donors, local business owners, a few reporters from community papers, and the kind of people who measured morality by how expensive the fundraiser was. Pastor Glenn Waverly stood near the front, laughing softly with Elaine. Bennett moved from table to table in a dark suit, shaking hands like every palm was a future vote. My mother saw me first. "Mara," she said, crossing the room with open arms. Her perfume reached me before she did. "You came." There was relief in her voice. Not love, relief. She believed my presence meant the family had been contained. "I told you I would," I said. Her eyes flicked behind me. "Alone?" "Yes." The word settled her. She touched my cheek the way she used to, before church photos. "Good. Tonight is important. Your father needs his daughters behind him." I almost asked which daughter she meant, but I let the question die in my mouth. Across the room, Gordon stood beside the stage, reviewing his note cards. He looked composed, authoritative, exactly like the man people trusted with difficult decisions. When he saw me, he gave a small nod, as if I had finally remembered my place. Bennett approached a few minutes later. "Smart choice," he murmured. "No drama tonight." I looked at the screen behind the podium. It was cycling through family photographs, my parents at charity events, my father with children from Harbor House, Elaine holding Clara in the backyard. "No," I said quietly. "Not the kind you're expecting." He glanced at me, but the lights dimmed before he could answer. The program began. Applause rose. My father walked toward the microphone, and the stage they had built for themselves finally belonged to the truth. My father began exactly the way I knew he would. He thanked the board, the donors, the church partners, the volunteers who gave time no one ever saw. His voice carried cleanly through the ballroom, warm enough to feel human, formal enough to sound permanent. People leaned in. That was his gift. He could make judgment sound like wisdom. Then the screen behind him shifted to a photograph of him and Elaine with Noah and Clara in the backyard. A soft sound moved through the room, the kind people make when children appear in a slideshow. My father smiled. "Elaine and I have always believed that service begins at home," he said. "The measure of a family is not what it claims in public, but how it protects the most vulnerable when life becomes difficult. I felt my fingers close around my phone. He turned one page of his notes. "No child," he said, "should ever be left outside a closed door." That was the sentence. The applause began, gentle at first, then fuller. Elaine touched the corner of her eye with one finger, careful not to disturb her makeup. Bennett stood near the side wall with his hands folded in front of him, already wearing the expression of a man imagining campaign photographs. I rose before the applause fully died. "Judge Whitfield," I said, loud enough for the first few tables to turn. My father looked at me. For 1 second, irritation crossed his face, then vanished beneath pride. "My daughter Mara," he said into the microphone. Of course, he thought I was there to bless the lie. I walked up the steps and took the second microphone from the stand. My mother's smile tightened. "I agree with my father," I said. "No child should ever be left outside a closed door." A few people nodded. Someone clapped once, unsure. I turned toward the AV technician, a young man near the curtain, and gave him the signal Renee had arranged. The slideshow disappeared. The screen went black. Then Owen Dillard's video began. Rain filled the speakers first. Not loud, but real. The timestamp glowed in the corner. Juliet appeared under the porch light. Clara hidden against her chest. Noah pressed to her leg. The room changed before anyone spoke. Bodies leaned forward. Glasses stopped halfway to mouths. On screen, my father opened the door. Juliet's voice trembled through the audio. "Dad, please. Noah's breathing is getting bad," my father said. "Then take him home." "I don't have a home tonight," Elaine's voice followed. "That was your choice." The door closed. No one applauded now. My father's face had gone gray. "Turn that off," he said. I did not. I let the silence sit long enough to become a witness. Then I played Bennett's voicemail about Juliet's instability and the children needing proper structure. After that, I put his draft remarks on the screen. The part where my parents were described as opening their home and hearts. Pastor Glenn stood first. He did not say a word. He simply left the table of honor. Then others began to turn, not toward me, but toward my parents. And for the first time in my life, Gordon and Elaine Whitfield were standing in a room they could not control. The room did not explode. That would have been easier for my parents. Explosions give people something to blame besides themselves. What happened instead was worse for them. The silence held its shape, and every person in that ballroom had to decide what kind of witness they were going to be. My mother moved first. "There is context," she said, her voice thin but still reaching for control. "This is a private family matter." I looked at her, then at the frozen image on the screen, Juliet standing under their porch light with 2 children in the cold. "You made it public," I said. "When you planned to accept praise for saving the children, you refused to shelter." Bennett stepped forward, face tight. "You have no idea what you've done." "I do," I said. "I stopped you from using my sister's pain as campaign material." My father did not look at the screen. He looked only at me, as if eye contact could still become an order if he held it long enough. "You destroyed this family," he said. For years, that sentence would have worked. It would have sent me backward into guilt, into apology, into the old training of keeping the picture clean. Not that night. "No," I said. I showed the room what happened when no one was supposed to see. Renee filed the emergency petition Monday morning. Dr. Camille Price provided the medical records. Owen Dillard turned over the original footage with the timestamp intact. Tasha Monroe, Noah's daycare director, wrote a statement about Juliet's consistency, her patience, the lunches labeled by day, the inhaler forms always signed on time. The story my family tried to build fell apart under ordinary facts. The court granted temporary protective restrictions within the week. Gordon, Elaine, and Bennett were not allowed contact with the children without supervision while the matter was reviewed. Bennett postponed his campaign announcement. Harbor House removed my parents' names from the Gala page. My mother sent one letter, hand-delivered, saying she wanted reconciliation. Juliet read it once and set it on the counter. "She doesn't say she's sorry. she said. No, I answered. She says she wants access. We did not respond. Life after that did not become perfect. Real safety is not cinematic. It is pharmacy pickups, court dates, school forms, midnight feedings, and learning which floorboards creak when a baby finally falls asleep. Juliet found remote cataloging work through the community college. Noah's breathing steadied. Clara began smiling at the ceiling fan like it had personally rescued her. My apartment stayed too small. The couch became Noah's fort. Bottles dried beside my coffee mugs. Some mornings, I stepped over toy trucks on my way to work and felt more peace than I had ever felt in my parents' spotless house. I used to think family was the name on the mailbox. Now I know better. Family is the person who opens the door when everyone else decides you deserve the cold. The hardest truth in this story is that not every person who uses the word family understands what family actually means. Some people use family as a shelter. Others use it as a leash. They say loyalty when they mean silence. They say forgiveness when they mean access. They say reputation when they mean fear. Mara's parents looked loving in photographs. They smiled at fundraisers, held their grandchildren in public, spoke beautifully about compassion, and built a life that looked respectable from the outside. But character is not proven under chandeliers. It is proven at the door, in the rain, when no one is clapping, when helping someone costs comfort, pride, or reputation. That is where the truth lives. Juliet did not need a perfect family that night. She needed an open door. She needed one safe room, one blanket, one adult willing to say, "Come in." And when that door closed, Mara became the family Juliet actually needed, not because she had all the answers, but because she showed up. She listened. She acted. She protected. Sometimes healing begins when we stop begging unsafe people to become safe. Sometimes peace begins when we stop trying to explain our pain to people who benefit from denying it, and sometimes love is not soft. Sometimes love is documentation, boundaries, court papers, late-night drives, and refusing to let someone rewrite the truth. Family is not proven by blood, last names, holiday photos, or what people say in front of a crowd. Family is proven by who stands beside you when your life is inconvenient, messy, and hard to defend. If this story touched something in you, I'd love to know your thoughts. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and doing what was right? What would you have done in Mara's place? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to remember this. The people who truly love you will not leave you outside in the cold.